Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the morning show. We're coming to you on Channel 9. We're also coming to you on WJOPLP Newburyport FM 96.3, and we're also live streaming on Newburyport Community Media's YouTube channel. Just go to www.ncmhub.org and click on the YouTube icon if you prefer to watch that way. It's easy to find. Well, I'm your host, Mary Jacobsen, and I'm very excited about today's show. I'm delighted to welcome Annika Terrana of the World Wildlife Fund. She's here to help us understand why the path to preventing another pandemic leads through caring for wildlife and natural habitats. And then later on in the show, Penny Lazarus of the Newburyport Coral Society will be here to talk about their first ever online fundraising auction. So let me introduce you to Annika. You know, she's here because today we're going to talk about, as I mentioned, those links between public health and the health of the natural world. My attention was just galvanized on this topic by an article in the fall 2020 issue of the World Wildlife Fund magazine with the absolutely attention-grabbing title of Sealing Pandora's Box, Protecting Nature to Help Stop the Next Pandemic Before It Starts. With all of us suffering from unrelenting pandemic fatigue, I'll bet that title gets your attention too. So I invited Annika Terrana from World Wildlife Fund here to help us understand better what we can do to stop the next pandemic. Anika specializes in the global market and trade of forest products and the private sector's impact on forests. She's a technical expert for the World Wildlife Fund on a range of topics, including participatory forest management and the multiple benefits for us all that come with healthy, resilient ecosystems. She earned her BA in History and Environmental Studies from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, an excellent school. So Anika, welcome. Thank you so much for taking time to visit us on the morning show.
I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, Mary, and hi, everyone.
My pleasure to have you. So let's start off, Anika, with I want to ask you if you could explain to us what a zoonotic disease is and what links the origins of our current pandemic to wildlife.
Very good question. We've heard that term quite a bit in relation to COVID. And a zoonotic disease or a zoonoses, it's a type of virus that jumps from animals over to people or spills over. We also hear the term spillover a lot, and that refers to that jump. So from animals to people, as it's often, often described as that spillover. And up to 3/4 of the infectious diseases that have affected people do come from animals. So the majority of infectious diseases in people are zoonoses. And more than 70% of those zoonoses come actually from wildlife rather than, say, domestic animals. So it's quite a big part of our disease discussions. And there's a lot of factors that can affect why a virus might jump from animals to people. But at the end of the day, it really comes down to the way much of the world's economies and practices have disrupted this kind of natural regulation of diseases that exists in the wild. And we're stressing animals out, eliminating their habitats, and consuming or using them at really high volumes, which just brings those zoonoses much, much closer, those viruses much closer to people in a number of ways. And for COVID, we don't know the exact origin, but we do know it's zoonotic because of its genetic makeup. And it's really likely that it came from bats, who tend to just as a species host a lot of different kinds of viruses. Just they have a high tolerance, so they tend to have a lot. And then it probably passed through an intermediary species or host species that allowed the virus to mutate and get closer to people, and then jump into people.
In other words, Anika, human beings and wildlife are inextricably linked.
Yes, that is true.
And that's an important understanding for us all to grasp. We're all interconnected. It's not just all people are connected to one another, but all species across the planet are connected with one another. And I think that that can be sadly, unfortunately, something that's easy for us humans who see ourselves as top of a pyramid somehow to forget and or neglect. Well, could you tell us a little bit more that how often do illnesses jump that species barrier. Spillover was the word you use, and impact humans. And can you give us some examples, perhaps prior to COVID, and maybe sketch the scope of the impact in loss of human life, especially compared to today's pandemic?
Yeah, there are a few prominent examples, some from more distant history, some more recent. Though from more distant history, they're not nearly existing with the frequency that we've started to see in recent decades. But there are three of the diseases that have led to the worst pandemics in human history that we might all recognize are the bubonic plague that was transmitted from fleas to fleas from rats to humans in the 14th century. That's a big one. We hear about that in the history books. It wiped out almost 60% of human populations at the time, and that's probably the most prominent, distant and a little unique for the times pandemic. But then there's the Spanish flu, which we've heard a lot about in this year because it's the worst pandemic. COVID is the worst since the Spanish flu. And that's said to originate in the United States. We don't exactly know. It eventually spread throughout the world, killing almost 50 million people. So also very big impact. And then I did want to mention HIV, the AIDS crisis. That spilled over from primates to humans in Central Africa, precipitating this AIDS crisis that's still affecting quite a few people, millions of people today. And that's seen over 32 million deaths. Over 37 million people are still living with it. And collectively, those three diseases alone, and there's been numerous other zoonoses that have led to outbreaks, but those three alone have killed more than all the wars of the 20th century combined. But I did want to just note that it's really the HIV epidemic that marks the start of a rather sudden upward trend in zoonoses in the last 60 years or so in recent decades. So about 1 to 2 new viruses have been discovered each year, have emerged each year, new zoonoses from wildlife to humans. And this correlates really to the same upward trend of major environmental changes globally, like deforestation, where the very natural and effective ways pathogens have kind of stayed contained have started to break down. And unfortunately, COVID has emerged as yet another example of zoonoses.
Those are dramatic statistics about the amount of human life lost to zoonotic diseases. And I'm glad it's interesting that you highlight HIV, because I think we in the United States tend to think of it as more contained now, but to hear the data about worldwide, how many people are still suffering from it, that's pretty dramatic. I think we also tend to forget that it was a zoonotic illness, that it originated in primates. And we may have developed perhaps a false sense of safety or imperviousness, because I remember in the 1980s, I was a hospital social worker. And I remember how, in the beginning, of course, to get an HIV diagnosis meant almost certain death. And there never was a vaccine, of course, for HIV, but treatments developed that have enabled it in the United States anyway to feel as though it's more contained. But I think that I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think it's helpful and important for us to put our current situation and just the prevalence of zoonotic diseases within a context that we don't remember the 1918 Spanish flu, most of us, but we do remember HIV. And so I think that's a helpful context to put our current situation in. So let me ask you this, Anika, from what I was reading, I mean, not all viruses are bad. They're part of the biodiversity on our planet.
Can't live without them, unfortunately.
Like bacteria. They're not all bad. Some of them we die without. And a lot of pathogens that inhabit wildlife never do spill over to impact human beings. So help us understand, what are the barriers, because the viruses are there and the wildlife is there, but there ordinarily are certain kinds of barriers that would prevent a zoonosis from spilling over and impacting human beings. So what are some of those barriers that ordinarily would prevent that spillover? And what are some of the conditions? You've referenced that conditions have changed worldwide, but spell out for us some of the conditions that have in fact increased this dramatic rise in novel viruses crossing barriers and creating then outbreaks among human beings.
Yeah, that's right. I'm glad you mentioned that because viruses are in fact not all bad, and we do need them. They're a necessary part of biodiversity, and there are so many different kinds. Just like there are different species of of monkeys and primates. There's tons and tons and tons of different
Yeah.
virus species, and nature has had its own way for millennia of regulating that. And they do help immune systems in a lot of ways. There's several ways that viruses are thought to be managed by a healthy environment where those barriers are there. It can differ by disease, but there are some commonalities, and there's really three root causes
Hmm.
that pose outside risk of spillover and of outbreaks.
Hmm.
And then they often, I just want to highlight, do often interact with each other
Hmm.
to really amplify the risk of drivers. And they they answer sort of both your questions of what the barriers are and what are the
Yeah.
trends, because it's really the breaking down of these natural barriers. So the sale and consumption and use of wildlife has really grown, the
Hmm.
trade in wild animals, and that is disrupting a really obvious barrier where we're just very close to wild animals when we're consuming them and when we're trading them. And then there's the expansion and the intensification of livestock, especially when there's not appropriate or detailed biosecurity measures, because you're again just kind of squeezing livestock
Hmm.
together, or you're expanding livestock into areas where wild animals might exist.
Ah.
And you're just increasing the number of animals that are mixing together and the viruses that are therefore jumping between animals that might then
Ah.
jump to
Okay.
people. And then lastly, as a precursor really to both of those, forests really are our first line of defense against disease. And so when we have the encroachment into forests or forest dominated habitats, especially in tropical countries where you have high wildlife biodiversity, um, that is the biggest barrier that we start to break down, which there's a number of reasons why that breaking down that barrier of habitat loss, of getting rid of forests, why that causes an increase in disease.
Well, that's striking the way you put that, that forests are our first line of defense. It
Yeah.
seems like an important thing for us to register. Could you explain a little bit more about how that works? How does a healthy forest ecosystem, and I know this is one of your specialty areas,
Mhm.
how do those healthy and balanced forest ecosystems protect us?
Yeah, I really appreciate that question because it's not always intuitive. And in fact, there's so much we're still learning from nature as to all the mysteries of and superpowers, really, that forests have and nature in general. But it is clear that deforestation and land use change of forests to other uses that bring people closer to formerly forested areas are the biggest underlying drivers of outbreaks. There's some estimates that it's responsible for over half of outbreaks in terms of
Wow.
origin. We're not always able to trace back to exact origin, but from what we've been able to track, that it's a really significant factor. And I have found that there's three components that are really helpful to understand why, that I like to highlight. And that's the level of hazard that a virus itself might just have on its own because of its
Hmm.
own composition or abundance or distribution and evolution. So how hazardous is an actual strain of a pathogen? But then also the level of exposure of people to that hazard, and then lastly how vulnerable people are.
Hmm.
And those three components, they they are they are heightened, and there's more pressure on those three components when we deforest.
Hmm.
And so when I say forests are our first line of defense, it's because they help reduce that hazard
Hmm.
for numerous reasons. When we degrade habitats and degrade forests, we tend to crowd um, we crowd individuals and populations of wildlife into smaller and smaller species. So then they have
Yeah.
higher relative population density, which just means you have a
Yeah.
whole lot more viruses that are able to jump in between and maybe replicate and amplify. And so you have a natural diversity that gets lost. You also have then certain wildlife that just can't really endure the stress of those
Mm.
conditions. So stressed animals, if you're squeezed in a habitat, you're more stressed, you're more likely to shed viruses, just like people who are stressed are often
Yeah.
more likely to have compromised immune systems. And then also just so happens that the species that are more adaptable to that fragmented landscape or threatened landscape, they happen to be the species that are also more adaptable to humans and therefore interacting with humans more.
Right.
So like rodents and, bats too, others that can just kind of move in and out between forests and then people landscapes. So that's one factor of the hazard. And then the exposure, you just have increased potential to interact with some of these wildlife that might be carrying these diseases. And then again, just the vulnerability you tend to have when you degrade or cut down forests. There are other ways that forests contribute to health that get compromised,
Mm-hmm.
and therefore can compromise people's respiratory health, or they might become more malnourished because the soil's now poorer because of the role that trees play in keeping soil healthy. Poverty might be higher. You might have poor water quality, and all these things can combine to make people more susceptible to a virus once it then makes the jump. So that's sort of a long-winded way of saying it's complex, and there are a lot of different ways that forests really serve as like our key first defense. That's why we call it Pandora's box.
Yes, absolutely. That's clear. No, that was a fabulous description of all of the different factors that come into play. All of the good things that happen when a forest is abundant and healthy, and all of the related and interconnected deleterious effects when we disrupt the quality and the abundance of forests. As you were talking, I thought about a traffic jam. Because when we take away the forest, of course, all of the wildlife, all of the animals, all of the viruses that are connected with the animals are constricted. It's like a gridlock then. And if you picture all those cars trapped in an intersection, but they're filled with viruses that then have the, okay, I hope we're scaring people.
Yeah.
Because we need to create healthy forests so that those metaphorical cars can have more room to roam and create a better ecosystem. Also, you mentioned the problems with illness. People frequently refer to, of course, the rainforest as the lungs of the planet.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, generating oxygen is one of the critical things for health of so many living beings that we are reducing, sadly, when we diminish the extent and range of forests. So thank you for that. That was a terrific explanation, one of the best I've heard. That was really great. We talked a little bit earlier about the global wildlife trade, which is also an impact. And I was hoping that you could tell us a little bit more about that, because I think a lot of us may not understand, what does that trade consist of? What kind of animals are being sold to whom, and for what purposes?
Yeah, good question. Really big global issue that I'm glad to see that at least it's getting much more attention, I think, with the spillover of coronavirus and COVID. So across the globe, people do rely on harvesting and collecting, trading, consuming wild animals and plants. And a lot of it is legal and a lot of it's sustainable and provides much needed income or nutrition in a lot of cases for people. But there's also really high volumes of unsustainable or illegal trade in wildlife and wildlife products. So a famous example would be ivory. Elephant ivory is traded in extremely high volumes. There is it's very valuable, huge illegal trade in ivory, but also pangolin scales. Pangolin is the most trafficked animal on the planet. Shark fins, rosewood, it's a really high value wood that's also often illegally traded. And so all of these things are causing unprecedented declines in wildlife species. But the wildlife crime is so global and so lucrative that it's over 10 billion a year in some estimates, and it's controlled by really organized crime syndicates because of its high value, and it is growing. So it's a big wicked problem to tackle. The unregulated wildlife trade is widely known to be a threat. I think it's commonly understood as a threat to conservation and to to wildlife and endangered species, but less so known for the risks it poses on the health side to the general public. And so to facilitate the kind of trade that exists, these kinds of volumes, it's really inevitable that there's just a whole variety of species, often very stressed out animals, because the conditions are, not only are they being removed from their home, but the conditions that they're traded in aren't good.
Yeah.
So therefore they're more likely to be shedding these viruses. They're much more likely to be mixed together in really high volumes with other kinds of species. And like we talked
Uh-huh.
about, that just facilitates more
Yeah.
jumping. And that in turn allows for just, viruses are smart. They're going to mutate, and what's called viral loading. They
Mm-hmm.
load up. There's higher amounts. The abundance becomes much higher of the virus itself, and all of this progressively increases the risk of spillover, and it just becomes much more dangerous and harder to contain once that
Yeah.
spillover occurs. It's a numbers game, really.
That's really interesting, because I think most of us think about the danger of global wildlife trade impacting the extinction of species,
Yeah.
like elephants being slaughtered for ivory, for example. But and that's still true. But what you highlight is also I think perhaps a less widely understood threat to public health
Mm-hmm.
because of the conditions and the circumstances that you were just outlining. Do you suspect or hope that as people come to a better understanding that our health is at risk, human beings' health is at risk from the global wildlife trade, that hopefully maybe more can be done to restrict and hopefully someday eliminate it, at least the non-sustainable aspects of it?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And WWF has huge efforts and programs and really strong partnerships in this area.
Yeah.
That's definitely the hope, to really bring together a much wider swath of partners
Hmm.
and policymakers, and consumers as well, who might
Yeah.
not know the impacts and might be seeking out some of these animal products themselves, and might not understand the impacts. Kind of bring together these large coalitions to stop the
Yeah.
illicit trade and reduce the trade to be
Hmm.
more sustainable where it's possible to be sustainable. Yep.
Well, you mentioned the word coalitions, and one of the next things that I wanted to ask you about was what we can do, what's being done about these problems, because we're in trouble
Yeah.
and we're headed for more and deeper troubles if we don't seal off Pandora's box somehow. So, what can human beings do to repair the harms that we've done, and who is the we that can do it, or a combination of we? That needs to take action? Is it corporations? Is it governments? Is it nonprofits like WWF? Is it local communities, or all the above? So who are the we, and what do we need to do?
Yes, it is definitely all of the above. We all have a role to play. But we're talking about a lot of really big, scary things. But the good news is that even though that there are these big drivers and common drivers for things like biodiversity loss, as well as zoonotic disease outbreaks, climate change also shares a lot of these same
Mm,
drivers. So the flip side of that is there are also shared solutions here. So we can be really efficient and effective actually in addressing all of these challenges together if we do have the right, the right political will, the right individual will. We can certainly keep pathogens from crossing those barriers,
mhm.
and protect nature. It really entails, I would say, three big areas. One, we got to stop deforestation, especially in areas of high or endangered biodiversity, with a focus of keeping intensive agriculture and new roads and urban areas, more away from the kinds of encroachment into forests that has been harmful. And a lot of companies, you mentioned, is this corporations, is this
Yeah.
governments? Corporations have a huge role, of course, because they are producing and sourcing and responding to consumer demand, and they have to source from these resources. So there's already a large amount of companies that are working to get rid of deforestation from how they operate. But supply chains are really complex, and we need more companies to be really
Hmm.
committed in that space. And they need us as everyday consumers and voters to make clear that we expect that.
Hmm.
And we expect them to avoid converting, habitats and supporting some of these large wildlife trades. So invest in restoring habitats that's been degraded. We can let companies know that we expect that by looking for sustainable options ourselves, if we have access to them. And then I wanted to say governments certainly have a big role to play as well. Often they can work with the private sector to provide the right regulation and policies so that companies can be successful ultimately in being more sustainable. And governments around the world can establish more conservation areas, community managed areas, and they can get better at managing the areas that already exist. And then lastly, did want to just really highlight the importance of collaborating with local communities and indigenous and native communities.
Mm.
There's tons of evidence, and history shows that when local communities' rights are recognized and when they have a voice in management of their own resources, when that's respected and honored, there tends to be much better longer term results. It's a really win-win-win. And so all three of these factors need to interact together for success. So we can expect of governments and companies the same kind of responsible management of our resources and collaboration with local communities. And as NGOs and just everyday consumers, like I said, pay attention to what we buy if we can, if we have access to that option. Pay attention to what we buy sustainable goods. That's really important for companies to understand that we in fact do expect it and demand it. So there's good news there, because I think surveys show that consumers really do expect that kind of thing. Even recent surveys from WWF across Southeast Asia, where there's a lot of consumption right now, and wildlife markets say that consumers really do want to shut down the higher risk trade, but there has to be that collaboration across corporations, government, and just we as everyday people.
Yeah, that's a lot of different levers that you describe that can be, and if pulled in tandem by all of the parties that you were just describing, it sounds like that is a worldwide force, that could be very, very high impact. And in fact, that's the next thing that I wanted to ask you about relating to our current pandemic, because some commentators have said that one useful impact of the pandemic is to make tangible and incontrovertible the interconnectedness, as we were talking about before, of everybody's behavior, everybody's consumer buying habits, everybody's choices, no matter where we live on the planet, that these all have an impact to have an impact on human health in one place these days is to have an impact on human place everywhere these days. So we certainly hope that will open eyes and motivate people to positive action to prevent more environmental damage and to improve our relationship with the natural world. And you've mentioned some research showing positive evidence of that shift, but I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more, because we can all use some encouragement these days, about some of the positive shifts that you see evidence of, Anika.
Yes, there are very tangible, material, and costly outcomes from the scale and the scope of how much conventional development has really altered the planet, like you just named. So there are shifts, though, that can be seen. So even in the investor and insurance world, environmental concerns are increasingly named as the biggest concern. But what hasn't quite changed, I do want to say, is this in practice, coordination between environmental conservation fields and health fields. And even with companies, their sustainability groups might function or operate separate from some of their other operations. And so I think moving toward true coordination and collaboration is where we'll see the most success. And there are ways that companies are starting to do that, and where philanthropy is taking also a role. You might have just seen this week, yesterday, 2 days ago, the Bezos Earth Fund. Amazon announced massive contributions to a variety of organizations. And while that's a lot of money, I think the most important piece there is actually what the contributions are going to, really supporting organizations that are looking at climate justice, for example, supporting WWF and some of our efforts too, on where there's the most climate impact and biodiversity impact, and then also health impact. Our health is so personal, and that makes climate change and biodiversity loss really personal. So I hope we can start to embrace that relationship. There is one thing I'll say: I am encouraged by, even just in the last few weeks, the incoming Biden administration is approaching climate change, not as a standalone issue,
Mm,
but as one to be addressed and embedded across priorities. There's
mhm.
already real evidence of that. And that's really what we need to do. Yes, in government, but also, in corporations are starting to look at that really kind of, these are not separate issues. So how can we address them together?
Yeah, clearly from everything you've been saying, you can't isolate one piece
Yeah,
and work on it
exactly.
because in the meantime, everything else is going haywire.
Right, exactly.
You have to coordinate, you have to integrate. I love, by the way, the phrase you use, climate justice, because that's a different frame than climate change, which is an important frame, but climate justice kind of suggests that there are unequal impacts on people around the world. And it also, to me, it suggests climate justice is also thinking about future generations.
Yeah.
And certainly we have an obligation to care for them. That's part of climate justice. Well, Annika, this has been so enormously interesting. I'm curious to find out, because you work in this field all the time, you're in the trenches, on the front lines. What makes you personally feel hopeful these days?
Well, like you just said, looking ahead, thinking about the next generation, there are so many, there's such momentum around grassroots activism, grassroots solutions, grassroots born solutions, and community organizing that's really bubbling up and influencing a lot of these larger conversations. And that's so exciting because one, it gives us some confidence and hope for the future, because it's a lot of younger people who are really holding some of us accountable to
Yeah.
do the things that we say we can and want to do. And so that makes me so hopeful. There's also so much ingenuity and innovation there in recognizing that really infinite growth on a finite planet it's a myth. There's no way
Yeah,
around it,
can't
and it's
happen.
right. It's hurting us. So that younger generation and local community organizing really sees that clearly. So we just need to listen to them. So really exciting clarity of vision and energy that is really energizing, and that's where I get a lot of hope.
Wonderful. Very well put. Well, of course, before I let you go, I need to ask you if people want to learn more about the World Wildlife Fund and how they can support or become involved in your work and have a positive impact, what resources can you suggest for people?
Thank you for that question. Absolutely. So you can go to WWF's website, especially I would highlight our action page. So
Mm,
there's a host of actions we have that anyone can take depending on what you might feel most passionately about, or what's most accessible to you. And that includes things at this intersection here. So if you go to worldwildlife.org and plug in action page into the
mhm.
search engine, it'll bring you to that page with lots of different ways where you can channel your interest and your energy. So we would appreciate appreciate the interest. And I'm also happy to be in touch with anyone who has follow-up questions or anything like that. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you, Annika. That was just wonderful. I learned so much, and it's all so important. Public health, natural health, we can't separate the two. It's the yin and the yang of it. So thank you so much, Annika. That was really wonderful. I so appreciate your taking the time to visit us on the morning show and explain these things. It was just wonderful to be able to interview you. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, everyone.
Okay, bye, Annika.
Bye.
Well, everybody, now it's my pleasure to welcome Penny Lazarus on screen. Penny, hi, welcome.
Hi, Mary.
Hi. Well, Penny is a highly respected musician, vocalist, and piano teacher in Greater Newburyport. She's also a section leader for the Newburyport Choral Society. She's a return visitor to the morning show. She's been on here before. I knew about her, the other amazing talents and gifts she had, but I recently had occasion to learn that she's also got a graduate degree in fine arts. And so she is a true Renaissance woman. So, Penny, welcome back to the morning show. I know that you have been hard at work organizing with others from NCS an online auctioned fundraiser that sounds very exciting. And you're here to tell us how it's going to work. So I believe, Penny, this is the first auction that the Choral Society has sponsored, isn't it? So tell us why now and how it'll work.
It is the very first auction. Many groups are doing these online auctions during this COVID period because they work so nicely on Zoom. So this is our first, and it has a really personal title for our group, for the Newburyport Choral Society. We're calling it Give Voice to the Newburyport Coral Society, a virtual silent auction.
Very fitting.
It is to help us keep rehearsals online as we have been holding very successfully, and it's important to keep our group together,
Yeah.
and so that when we can return to performing, not only are our voices warmed up, but we've been learning our music, and we haven't lost any camaraderie as being together as a group, so essential for choral singing. But there are costs involved with putting on, technical online rehearsals, and without concert tickets to sell,
Right.
the auction will help us to meet some of those needs. And it's also,
Right.
um, our auction platforms and our rehearsal platforms are great places for our sponsors to put in ads, for their own businesses.
All right. Yes, good to know. Sponsors are welcome. Well, Penny, tell us about some of the items that people will be able to bid on.
And you know what? The items have been coming along so beautifully. It's been a wonderful surprise and a treat. These things start as a little tiny idea, as a germ, and then it's really exploded. So it's going to be a lot of fun. We have almost 100 items.
Wow, that's impressive.
Decided to open up the bidding tomorrow,
Okay.
ahead of schedule.
Hmm.
And so all someone has to do is go to the Newburyport Choral Society website.
Hmm.
And you can find the auction site there and start perusing what items you'd like to put bids on. And many of the bids will only increase by $1 or
Hmm.
$5. So during this, 2 week period, it should be a lot of fun to watch your bids. There's all kinds of things. Many online auctions will try to just have maybe 20 or 25 big items, and they see that as successful for their fundraising. This one's a little bit different. We wanted to collectively have all kinds of items that represented the wealth of talent in our choral group, because our singers are very talented, not just with their voices, but with crocheting and knitting and cooking skills, and they paint and they sculpt, and they draw and they make note cards, and all of these things are on the auction site. So it's unusual to find so many inexpensive items to bid on that will be just perfect for
Hmm.
holiday giving.
Well,
So
that sounds just fabulous. And it also sounds as though a way to ferret out and understand the many talents among the people who've been sitting beside you at chorus rehearsals for years and years, and you might not ever have known what a talented artist they were, a fabric artist or a sculptor. So it sounds as though you've had the opportunity to engage in some wonderful discoveries of unknown talents, and then turn around and auction them off.
exactly, Raku Pottery by Nancy Cahan.
Ah.
There are Phil's rum balls, which are very famous at our after concert receptions. There are two quilts to be
Oh.
homemade quilts. There's a pick your own perennials. Jenda Armand's garden is gorgeous, and so this will be for the summer.
Hmm.
Will welcome somebody, and they can choose what perennials, and she will dig nice handfuls up, so you can take them to
Ah.
your own garden. And who knew that Terry Harmon lives right on the Pistakawa River, and she's offering a canoe ride complete with lunch. So there's lots of wonderful things. There's antiques for sale. There's an antique dollhouse, an antique doll's high chair. There's an antique child's rocking horse. Beautiful, beautiful things of all kinds. Museum memberships. So there's a set of Norman Rockwell prints, and an authentic Harper's Weekly 1867 page of
Oh.
the launching of the Steamboat Erie. So perfect for this area where we have, so much interest in the rivers and
Hmm.
in boats. So There's just this huge, wide range of things. And it's all COVID proof. So they're things that you
Ah,
bid on now and pick up as gifts. But if they're things like dining with someone, like my husband is from New Mexico, and we are offering an 8-person New Mexican dinner at
ah.
colonial house, our 200-year-old house. But by summer, it should be safe to either eat outside in the garden or eat inside this historic house, an authentic New Mexican meal. So, so
It's just inspiriting to visualize a summer meal, feeling safe, something devoutly to be wished for. But also, Penny, I'm struck by just the range of items, not just as you're saying, from the smaller to the larger, very affordable things that people can easily bid on to larger things that they could bid on, like some of the antiques, for example. So, and also the type of things, ranging from a home cooked meal to, to artwork, original artwork, to a canoe trip. So that's quite the range. And it sounds like it should be really fun for people simply to peruse through the auction pages on the Newburyport Choral Society website.
yes, and there's also to be expected lots of music lessons being offered.
I'll bet.
Right, for percussion to piano to voice. Our past music director, George Case, is offering an hour voice lesson with him or conducting lesson. And our current music director, Ryan Turner, is offering either an hour lesson with him on voice or a cabaret with dinner this summer at his house.
Wow. Okay. Some high-end talent then.
Yes.
So the bidding has started already.
It will be starting tomorrow.
Tomorrow it will start. And how long will it go?
Until December 5th.
Okay. So people can track their bid. They can check if they've been outbid by a little bit or a lot. They can check and they can raise their bid and kind of track online. If there's something you really want, you just be a good detective and make sure that you keep checking, right?
Exactly. That's how it works. So you keep checking back in.
Excellent.
Amounts by a few dollars, and it's just a lot of fun to keep, to be in competition with somebody else. But
Oh,
there's just lots of great things.
absolutely. Penny, it sounds like so much fun and what a wonderful idea. I did want to ask you, I know that everybody is going to miss, and transparently, I belong to the Choral Society myself, and everybody in the community, the singers, we're all going to miss the winter concert, which is always sold out. And it's a highlight for the community. So, this auction will be a way to help fill in, as you were saying before, the missing ticket sales there would have been for this concert. But tell us a little. I'm sure people are interested in finding out, how's the Choral Society faring, and what are hopes and plans for the spring looking like at this point?
Well, things are changing by the week. So if you would have asked this question a few weeks ago, there was discussion that we would probably not even be able to put on our usual May concert. So I don't want to get ahead of the board in any of those discussions. But now that we know that vaccines are being approved,
Yeah.
we are expecting that we will, if not by this spring, we should be able to do a performance that would be part of our summer sing. So stay tuned. I'm sure we will be able and be back up and performing under the exciting baton of Ryan Turner. If not, the end of spring, then during the summer, perhaps during our Yankee homecoming week here in Newburyport. So we're
Well,
working on our music, and the rehearsals online have been fabulously attended. We have average about 100 singers every rehearsal. And even though when we sing with Ryan conducting and playing the piano, we can't hear each other, everybody still feels like we are learning and moving forward. And the online rehearsals have given us an unusual opportunity to dig into and understand rhythm and counting and voice production. And we've even gotten into IPA phonetic pronunciation, which is really important for the best quality of choral sound. And We've been engaged with talks about music and Black Lives Matter and equity across music singing and the music selection that is used. So it's really been a very exciting semester, even online.
Even online.
Sign up for January. So people are please welcome, follow the New River Choral Society page and sign up for the winter months. There's nothing better than to do something like this in January, February, and March.
That's absolutely right. And we all need things to look forward to. Absolutely. Penny, thank you so much for that description. Finally, one more time, tell people what website to look at.
So we're going to go to www.newburyportchoralsociety.org. That is our website. And on the website, you will find the link to go to give voice to a silent auction of goods, deeds, and adventures. Starts tomorrow, ends December 5th at midnight.
Wonderful. Penny, thank you so much for coming on the morning show to talk to us about the auction and describe some of the treats that will be available for people to bid on. I really appreciate it.
Oh,
Thank you so much.
it's
It's
always a
great,
pleasure.
great to see you. Well, all right, everybody, that's it for this morning's morning show. I hope you'll join us in 2 weeks for the next morning show when my guest will be exhibit co-curator Petra Card of the Peabody Essex Museum. She'll be here to talk about their new exhibit called Made It, the Women Who Revolutionized Fashion. With this exhibit, as they say, Peabody Essex Museum will go behind the scenes to reveal the often overlooked contributions of women in the fashion industry. Made It celebrates women who revolutionized many aspects of the fashion world, and it traces how these efforts parallel the history of women's global struggle for equity and opportunity. So please join us for that. It sounds fascinating to me. If you missed any part of today's show, it'll be available for viewing on PortMedia's YouTube channel playlist for the morning show, www.ncmhub.org. Just click on the YouTube icon. Each show will also air on WJOP FM 96.3 on Friday morning at 8 a.m. and then again the following Tuesday at 4 p.m. and Wednesday at 3 p.m. And will also be available as a podcast on the SoundCloud. Again, just click on the cloud icon at www.ncmhub.org and then scroll down. Thanks for watching, everybody. It means a lot to me to have you there. Hope you'll join us in 2 weeks for Petra Slingard and Made It. Bye, everybody.